Welcome back to Under Oath. Avi, it's so good to talk to you. I've read some of your things. I've seen some of your interviews. And I got to tell you, you're probably one of the most interesting professors over at Harvard.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Now, there's a lot of people in the community who have issues with some of the things you discuss, considering, elements, aliens existing and everything like that. But we just had about 5 days in Congress of hearings on potential UFOs, and they call it different things. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to feel that there's something outside of us?
Well, for the same reason that it was difficult for people to accept that the Earth is not at the center of the universe. We have a sense of self-importance. We are focused on ourselves. And, I saw it with my two daughters when they were very young. They got all the attention from the family, and they thought that they are the center of the world. And of course, they had a psychological shock when we brought them to the kindergarten, and they realized there is a smarter kid on the block. So, humans started the same way. We thought that we are the center. Then we realized, no, the Earth is moving around the sun, which is moving around the galaxy. Okay, we are not at the physical center, but we are still very important, unique, special. There is nobody as smart as we are, not only on this Earth, but also very far away. And so to change that conception is difficult. We tend to believe the stories that give us importance, and that's the reason for for this pushback that you see around.
Now, you're not somebody who says, "Oh, I was out in the woods, I saw something." I mean, you have PhDs, you've taught at Princeton, you got tenured at Harvard after 3 years. I mean, that requires a ridiculous amount of time and education. How tough was it for you to go, okay, I want to talk about it, but I know my peers are going to give me a lot of heat?
Well, I didn't care much about my peers. I basically tried to follow common sense. The U.S. government talks about it. The public is very interested in this question, and it's the duty of scientists to get engaged with it. More than they do with extra dimensions that are some imagined reality that we don't know if it exists. And for decades, theoretical physicists put it as part of the mainstream. Here we're talking about objects that military personnel and intelligence people report about that are not understood. Also, some astronomers, we found the first object from outside the solar system, interstellar object, to be unlike the rocks that we are familiar with in the solar system. The best example is this meteor that was spotted by U.S. government satellites a decade ago, and it was moving extremely fast and had material strength that is much tougher than all space rocks cataloged by NASA. So I decided a couple of months ago to go to the Pacific Ocean in an expedition and retrieve the materials from this meteor. We found those materials, we analyzed them in the laboratory at Harvard University, and we confirmed that they came from outside the solar system. So, just doing that received a lot of pushback, both before the expedition and after. And, I just followed the work of science, where we are seeking materials to analyze them, to figure out something. And I'm just seeking new knowledge. And all these experts that are around me that base their knowledge on what we learned in the past are not willing to gain new knowledge. And that's disappointing, because we should be all curious. That's what science is all about. Curiosity, trying to figure out what our environment is like.
Now, what I find interesting is, I've collected different kind of precious metals, semi-precious metals, and I have a couple meteorites, and it's always the same thing. It's made of the same thing that we have. Now, why should we even, limit the elements that we think exist solely because we haven't had them here?
Yeah, I mean, currently we believe that we have a complete census of all the elements in the periodic table, and there is nothing beyond that. Of course, that may not be true, but that's what we know. So when I retrieve materials, we are using instruments that analyze it based on what we know. And of course, there could always be surprises where you see something that you don't know about. We haven't seen that in the sample that we collected, but for example, we know that 83% of the matter in the universe is of a substance that we never witnessed here in the solar system. It's called dark matter. We don't know what it is. One of the unsolved puzzles over the past 90 years.
Now, when I hear people talk about things like this, and this is where I think it becomes difficult for you. There's a huge group out there who are interested in aliens and things like that, and these shows make millions of dollars and these books make millions of dollars, but they're not really based on scientific issues. I mean, how do you come out, going, no, listen, I'm a scientist. This is what I'm doing, and try to avoid the stereotype, oh, he's talking about aliens?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So on both sides, I have challenges. On one side, as I mentioned, the academic community not willing to discuss it. They ridicule it. They're not seeking evidence. They're not following the scientific method. They just have an opinion and are very critical. On the other side, you have people who make statements without any evidence, just because they believe in it. And I'm trying to take the middle ground, which follows common sense. Basically saying, there are intriguing reports from government. Also, there are some unusual objects that astronomers are seeing. Let's figure out their nature by collecting more evidence. And what I find is that common sense is not common.
When we talk about issues like this, I always think about the issues because I know there are, for example, I'm also a lawyer. I do a couple things, and I know lawyers who specialize certain fields. They don't want anything to diminish their field. So I think it's probably what you're dealing with is you have people who've taught this and they're absolutely positive. And if you're right, they could be wrong.
Yeah, of course. One has to be open-minded in order to learn something new. If you always insist that you already know the answer, like the adults in the room, then you will miss on new knowledge. And I very much prefer to play the role of the kid who asks the difficult questions that we don't have a good answer to. And those who pretend to be the adults in the room, they miss an opportunity to learn something new. And I want to stay like that, like a curious farm boy that I was born as, and not be swayed by pressure from social media or peer pressure. Just do what sounds sensible, collect evidence, and see what it shows.
Now, Avi, the hard thing about taking risks and taking challenges and putting yourself out there is that, the abuse you can take on something like this. And I know a lot of people would go, why is he doing this? Why is this for what reasoning? And because it's really tough to take risks like you're taking, what keeps you going and going, listen, I don't care what people say. I don't care what, issues I have. I know I'm right.
Well, I have a lot of support that is not visible publicly. I mean, the people that are making negative remarks and personal attacks, they are very visible. They try to gain from the attention that I get because nobody knows them otherwise. So they gain their attention by saying bad things about what I'm doing. And, the approach that I take to that is the approach of the eagle that has very often a crow on its back that is pecking at its neck. And the eagle, instead of fighting off the crow, rises to greater heights where the oxygen level is low and the crow just drops off because the crow cannot survive at that level. And so in my case, the greatest height that I can get to is doing the science the way it should be done, by collecting evidence, reporting about it in a scientific paper. And at that point, I hope that the crows will drop off my back and stop pecking at my neck. Now, that's what I hope. But what really happens is that they don't read the details of my paper. For example, the one that came out this week, they just make derogatory comments very superficially. But I prefer not to engage because if you were to mud wrestle, you would get dirty.
Now, the one thing I think about is I deal with attorneys who are always arguing. That's always what they do. They always try to find something. And there's a rule. If you don't have the law, you pound the facts. If you don't have the facts, you pound the table. And in your situation, you go, okay, here are the facts. This is what I have. Do you find them challenging you by just pounding the table, or do they ever come back and go, well, no, that's impossible because of this?
Yeah, so very, very few people are open-minded enough to engage in a scientific discussion the way, it should be done. And I just don't understand that. Now, of course, young people are open-minded, but when they see the attacks, they hesitate because they are looking for a job. But I do have a lot of people around me that are working on the science. I have 3 postdoctoral fellows as a result of donations by, for example, one of them by the Brinson Foundation, a very prestigious foundation in Chicago. They just approached me and said, we would like you to mentor young people and encourage them to innovate. So there are a lot of people in society that are inspired by what I do and support me. And that gives me strength, and it also allows me to recruit people with like-minded agenda. And my hope is that we will prevail because we are, as I said, I'm just trying to do what common sense says. And I know it's difficult for some people to accept, but I think eventually, once the evidence is strong enough, the tide would switch over. And then those other people will have to, explain what their opinions are. And I think what they would say is that they knew it all along, that in fact, this is nothing new. But that would be fine. I mean, I wish them happiness.
Well, you said you grew up in the farm, and I assume this was in Israel?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, I served 6 months in the Middle East with the multinational force, and I had to walk the desert of Sinai. And I try to tell people what looking at the sky in the Middle East is like compared to trying to look at the sky here. You just see the vastness of space so differently. I mean, do you think that inspired you at all?
Well, what inspired me in my childhood was the fact that I grew up on a farm, that I was connected to nature and paid less attention to what people say. And that's the way I am right now. And the most traumatic experience I had was at the dinner table when I would ask a difficult question. The adults in the room would dismiss the question because they didn't know the answer. And it was obvious to me. So I decided I'll become a scientist and figure out the answers myself. And guess what? I became a scientist to figure out the answers, but I still see my colleagues behaving exactly the same way as the adults in the room. And so nothing changed really. But my hope is that, common sense will prevail.
Now, your book that you just put out, Interstellar, what do you think my biggest takeaway from it will be? Because I'm going to order it. What do you think? What would you like me to walk away with after I'm done reading it?
Well, with a sense that we are all in the same boat, all humans, and the boat is Earth sailing through space. And therefore, we should work together towards a longer-term future rather than fighting each other. And my hope is that the wake-up call will come from a package that we will discover at our doorstep that came from a neighbor. And that will change our perspective, change our priorities, and change the way human history will continue into the future.
Now, when we talk about your study and what evidence you put forward, what do you think is the most important piece where you go, see, this is what I have. This is what I would like people to accept?
Yeah, so it's the scientific method of collecting evidence. So what I did in the Pacific Ocean was look for materials that belong to the first interstellar object that we know about and bring them to study in the laboratory. That's the way science is done. I wrote, during the expedition, 43 diary reports. And the millions of people around the world read them, and they were translated to Spanish. And a lot of people wrote that they were inspired. It's the first time they saw how science is done. There are many people who talk about science and popularize science, but they're not really doing science. I'm talking about science while doing it. That's the main difference. When you look at Neil deGrasse Tyson or Brian Greene, while they're talking about science, they're talking about science that other people are doing. I'm talking about the science that I'm doing. It's really work in progress. It's a learning experience. And, I feel that it's important for the public to see how science is done because otherwise the public gets the notion that science is a occupation of the elite. And what it really is like a detective story where you collect as much evidence as possible, try to make sense of it. And it's a human endeavor where we could make mistakes along the way. We don't pretend to be smarter than everyone else. We are just curious. We were given the privilege of figuring things out.
Understanding that the only way knowledge is passed on and the only way we create more people like you is to actually have classes in it. What would you like we have about 3 minutes left. What would you like university systems to do as far as taking what you've learned and allowing more people to come in and proceed forward with your findings?
Yeah, I think most importantly, there is a lot of talk about improving diversity, inclusion, equity in academia. But I think one thing is not attended to very often, which is diversity of opinion. All these other items are very important, but it's also important to encourage people to think independently and allow dialogues of people that do not agree with each other, because then both sides learn something. And unfortunately, we see polarization in our political system, but also in academia where you're supposed to think like everyone else. And there is always some police monitoring. If you are not thinking like everyone else, you get noticed and warned. And that's not a healthy intellectual environment because, very often innovation comes from directions that the majority of people do not expect. So in order to promote innovation in academia, we must allow different opinions and we must allow dialogues. And, that is not nurtured. And when I jog every morning at sunrise, I often see signs at the neighbors' yards, and they usually say the same thing that all the neighbors agree on, which doesn't serve any good purpose. You're saying something that your neighbors agree with, and that is just like, I call it virtue signaling. You're signaling your virtues. But what really makes sense is for you to go to a neighborhood that doesn't agree with you and put the same sign there just to convince other people that you are right and change their opinion. That would actually make a difference. And that is not practiced in academia these days.
Well, one last question I'd like to ask you, and it's going to be quick. People have their favorite quotes. If I had to ask you what your favorite quote would be, what would it be?
Yeah, my favorite quote would be of Oscar Wilde. He said that the only people who appear normal to him are those who he doesn't know very well.